So Malcolm Rifkind is a British politician, a man who's been in politics for 50 years, was the British foreign minister. So Malcolm, before we get your assessment of democracy or the current state of democracy, why did you get into it? Why should you've dedicated your life to democracy and politics, or democratic politics. Why?
I think my downfall began as a result of a very British tradition. At most of our schools, we have debating societies. And when I was 15 years old, I didn't volunteer, I was pushed into school debating. And I continued to do that both at school and at university. And if you are 15 or 16, you're just beginning to mature, you're becoming interested in public issues. And if you take part in debates, then you're actually having to find out a bit about them. So in those days, it was debates about capital punishment.
Where were you at school, by the way?
In Edinburgh, school in Edinburgh,
yeah.
Day school in Edinburgh. So issues like abortion, nuclear weapons, whether Britain should be a monarchy or not, various issues, apartheid in South Africa. So you were not only having to understand these issues, you were having to be prepared to sort of argue them and hear the other point of view. And I think one of the great reasons why democracy can flourish is if at a very early age, youngsters in their teens get interested in these subjects, not in an aggressive way, but just as a way of understanding that most issues are not black or white, they're shades of gray. There's usually pretty good arguments on both sides of an issue. And democracy is not about the majority having total power and the minority having no power. It is getting a balance that makes everyone feel they have a stake in the system.
Many of the pessimists these days suggest that the gray you talk about, that area of debate between right and left, liberals and conservatives, that's the casualty somehow of our contemporary age. And people have lost the ability to debate and accept the legitimacy of other people's points of view. Over the last 50 years, do you think that political debate has declined? Have people lost the ability to stop listening to one another, particularly people of different opinions?
If you're asking me over a timescale of 50 years, then you should be an optimist, not a pessimist. Because looked at in that sense, we are hugely stronger in terms of democratic values than we've ever been in the history of mankind. And the main dramatic change, you think back, neither of us were alive at the time, but before the Second World War, even Europe had virtually no democracies. You had Britain, you had France, but Germany had Hitler, Italy had Mussolini, Spain had Franco, and then we had all the Eastern European countries dominated by communism for 50 years, and the Greeks had a military junta, and Portugal had Salazar. This is Europe I'm talking about, never mind the rest of the world. So what happens? Fast forward to the end of the Cold War.
89.
89, when the Berlin Wall comes down. And you not only have all the East European countries, Poland, Czechs, Hungarians, Romanians, Poles, and others, choosing the democratic system, becoming and practicing it to a very significant degree. But it's not just Europe. It is also in the Far East. Maybe not China, sadly, and not just Japan. South Korea had been a dictatorship, is now a practicing democracy. The same is true of Indonesia, the biggest Muslim country in the world. The same is true of the Philippines. The same is true of Malaysia and of India, of course, which is soon to be the largest country in terms of population in the world. It's been a practicing democracy for 50 years. Latin America. Latin America used to be a byword for generalissimos and juntas and all that sort of thing. Now, with the exception of Castro's Cuba and Venezuela, sadly, virtually the whole of Latin America now has democratically elected governments. So what we have seen in the last few years has been a bit of a setback. That is true. People are right to be concerned.
Since, say, 89. But was 89 or the early 90s, was that the high point of democracy? Don't we have a slide back? But you mentioned a lot of countries. Certainly the Philippines now is veering towards authoritarianism. So is Brazil, so is Turkey.
I want to make what I think is a very important point. The big mistake we made after 1989, after the end of the Cold War, we had this concept called liberal democracy. And we thought that liberal democracy was one thing. And you either had it or you didn't have it. What we've had to come to terms with is it's not one thing, it's two separate things. There is democracy and there are liberal values. And sometimes they're combined, and sometimes they aren't. Let me explain what I mean. Hong Kong, when it was a British colony, certainly wasn't a democracy. It was a colony of the United Kingdom, but it did have the rule of law. It had democratic values, liberal values, free speech, free travel, all the freedoms that we take for granted. So that was an example of where you can have liberal values without being a democracy. What we are now seeing in a number of countries is countries that are democratic, but they are questioning liberal values. You mentioned the Philippines. Now, Duterte, we may not like him, but he was freely elected by the Filipino people. He had an overwhelming majority. So he has the legitimacy of being a democratic leader, unlike Putin, unlike Xi Jinping. He was elected, as was Bolsonaro in Brazil, as was Trump in the United States.
So when, say, Prime Minister Orban in Hungary talks about, and boastfully about, being in an illiberal Democrat, those two words aren't contradictory in any way?
Well, they're not absurd, because you mentioned Orban, it's a good example. Orban won something like 60% of the vote in what was a genuine free election. It wasn't a rigged election. And he did it on a platform of pushing back on some of the liberal values. Now, I don't approve of Orban. I think it's very sad what is happening there. The point I'm making is that we have to make a distinction between what is happening to liberal values in many countries and whether they are ceasing to be democratic.
So we have a crisis of liberal values rather than a crisis of democracy.
The one could lead to the other. If you destroy liberal values, it may only be a matter of time before the democracy itself comes under question. But I'm saying we're not remotely there at the moment, and there is no evidence that the people who have elected pretty illiberal leaders wish to get rid of democracy. The people. Let me just illustrate what I mean by that. Obviously, in the United States, as an example, Trump is not exactly a paragon of liberal values, and yet the people of America have not the slightest intent to give up the democratic society that they enjoy in a practicing way.
Would you include Trump in the Duarte, Bolsonaro, Erdogan bucket?
The problem with Trump is he's none of these, but he seems to like authoritarian leaders. He seems to be impressed by them. He seems to prefer them to people with liberal values. In fact, he makes no secret of the fact, and he's rather envious that Putin or Xi Jinping can just make a declaration and it all happens.
I said you've been in politics for more than 50 years. You've stood for parliament many times, mostly winning, occasionally losing. So you're familiar with the electorate. Has the electorate changed over the last 50 years? There's been more and more research suggesting that people want authoritarian leaders, that they don't trust the Democrats anymore. They want the Trumps and the Duartes and the Bolsonaros.
Well, there is in some indication that may be true for some people, not necessarily a majority, but for some people. But I think the real break, paradoxically, was the end of the Cold War and the triumph of democracy. Because during that whole Cold War period, I grew up, I was born in 1946. So for the whole of the first 50 years of my life, the big issue wasn't getting into the details of democracy and liberal values. It was communism or democracy. It was the Soviet system or the Western system. And when the public as a whole knew that that was the threat, that was the challenge, you couldn't afford the luxury of working out what kind of democracy you preferred or what you didn't like. Now, when communism collapsed, and communism has collapsed, it's literally collapsed in Russia, but in China they call themselves communists, but they're a form of state authoritarian dictatorship, using a historical term called the Communist Party to describe what they're up to. So, but when communism disappeared as a threat to the world as a whole, that meant there was not an ideological choice the public were being asked to make. And therefore, inevitably, when your political choices at an election are people who have basically the same ideology of a democratic system, then people then become more interested and more aware of the personalities they like or dislike, the emphasis of one candidate compared to another.
Over the last 50 years, not only democracy has changed, not only the global international system has changed, but the nature of capitalism. Some of the guests we've had on this show have suggested that the problem with democracy these days is that the free market capitalist system has enabled or caused so much profound economic inequality, both inside countries and globally, internationally, that's the problem. The problem isn't politics, the problem is economics. Now, I'm guessing as a loyal conservative, you're not against the free market, but do you think one of the reasons why populism is so strong these days is because of an uncontrolled capitalism?
I think if you look at it from a historical point of view, and I'm not just talking about capitalism, I'm talking about massive changes in the world in which we live. What happens is somebody, either an individual or people at a given time, find a new truth, something they believe in is going to transform the world. And sometimes they have the power to actually deliver that. And they achieve big change. Now think of how we had the Reformation in the 16th century. What did it lead to? It led to the Counter-Reformation. But the Counter-Reformation didn't go back to square one. It created a new equilibrium. And so what we've had with capitalism, for example, capitalism undoubtedly has created more wealth than any other economic system in history. But even as capitalism was being implemented in the 19th century, not just recently, we realized in the United States you had to have antitrust legislation or anti-monopoly legislation in the United Kingdom, because companies left to themselves would not work entirely in the public interest. So there has to be regulatory controls, there has to be financial controls. The private sector has to be constrained. And the debate is not whether that is necessary, but have we done enough? So when we had the financial crash, the Lehman Brothers and so forth, basically what people concluded was not that capitalism wasn't working. That would have been absurd. What they did conclude was that the degree of financial oversight had been weakened too much and had to be re-strengthened to take account of the realities of life. So that is the nature of any period in our history, not just modern life. Let's not kid ourselves that somehow we're all fundamentally different to 100, 200, 500 years ago. The issues are different, the details are different, the way we see the world is different, but in each period of history, what you see are changes quite often influenced by technology, influenced by science, influenced by geography, influenced by exploration, and that's how the world transformed. And so for several hundred years, Europe and then Europe and the United States basically dominated the whole world with the great empires.
We're in Kansas City, but I can't resist asking you about Brexit. I'm less interested in your opinion of whether the British should or shouldn't leave the EU, and more on whether or not the Brexit story reflects a strength or a weakness in British politics and democracy in particular.
I'm going to answer your question directly, but before I do, I want to make a more general point, very relevant to Brexit. It looks as if there's a complete shambles in Britain. The system doesn't work. We're not producing answers. We're caught in this great national disagreement. Remember one thing. Yes, we're having a great shambles, but it's peaceful. There are no yellow vests. There are no riots in the streets. There are no water cannon. And if the government are losing power, they're not over Brexit, they're not losing it to the mob in the street. They're losing it to Parliament. That's what a parliamentary democracy is about. So Parliament, MPs, members of Parliament, very often the public say, why does my member of Parliament not use his own judgment instead of cravenly following the party leadership, the whips and so forth? Well, by God, that's happening now. Not just on the Conservative side, on the Labour side as well. The two major parties are unable to reach a majority conclusion at this moment as we speak, but they're conducting a great public debate about the whole future of our country and its relationship with its nearest neighbours. Now that's the good side. There is a downside as well, no question about it, because what happens when you have one of these massive decisions that affect your future, you have on either side of the argument people who are not just rational, but they're emotional, and they sometimes exaggerate either the strength of their own argument or the weakness of the other side.
Some of them even lie, don't they?
Well, they may not think they're lying, but they're telling untruths.
They're telling fibs.
One of our great diplomats before the Second World War, Harold Nicholson, he once said that the worst people to choose to negotiate for your country are either lawyers, fanatics, or missionaries. Why? Because if you're trying to resolve a problem through diplomatic and political means, you need compromise. And lawyers say, these are the rules, we cannot change the rules. Missionaries say, it's my faith, how can I compromise on my faith? Fanatics speaks for themselves, speaks for itself. So that's why you actually need politicians and you need diplomats of a traditional kind, because the essence of what they're trying to do is to find the compromises that don't devalue the reform or the change, but nevertheless make it workable and make everyone along the whole spectrum of public opinion feel they can live with this. It's very interesting, for example, Britain's got many faults, but because we don't have a written constitution, we can actually be extremely flexible. So, for example, in Northern Ireland, part of the United Kingdom, we have what is called statutory power sharing. Regardless of the result of the election, the majority and the minority, Protestants and Catholics, have to be part of a coalition for local self-government in Northern Ireland. In Scotland, where I come from, in recent years we now have a Scottish Parliament, very powerful. Much more we did not have a parliament for 200 years. Wales, the third part of the United Kingdom, does not have a parliament, but it has an assembly, and one day it will have a parliament. It also is evolving its political institutions. England, where 80% of the population live, they don't want to be broken up into regions with their own parliaments. But what we are seeing is a massive transfer of resources from London, which is the capital, but also dominates the economic and political life, to the regions of England. So in a very British way, you have a flexible system of reform, not because somebody produced some great blueprint, but we stumble into solutions. That's the way we do it over the centuries.
You mentioned over the last 50 years, not only has there been a profound change in economics and the geopolitical system, but also in technology. When you got involved in politics, there was no email, there was no social media, there was no Google, there was no Facebook. How do you think that these dramatic changes in digital media has changed the nature of politics and democracy?
It has changed it, in some respects for the better, in some respects much worse. But the point I would most emphasize is I think we should think of ourselves as going through a transition. When social media became so dominant, it excited huge numbers of people, particularly younger people, and it suddenly replaced traditional newspapers, traditional news channels as being a source of information. Gradually, we've all become aware how unreliable social media is as a source of news, as a source of hard, reliable information. Not because they always get it wrong, very often they get it right, but there's a lot of wicked people who have an interest in distorting information. So I think what we are gradually seeing is people in Britain and America and other countries saying social media is good, we don't want to get rid of it, couldn't even if we wanted to, but we can no longer accept that all the information that you read about on Facebook or on other forms of social media is reliable. If you want to be certain about information, you have to check it. You have to go somewhere where either a more reputable quality newspaper or usually Wikipedia is at least attempting to be factually accurate. Occasionally they make mistakes, but they're not politically biased, so far as I'm aware. And there are ways in which you can deal with it. So we will move towards a situation where social media is a very important part of our lives. But the very term social media will indicate the limits of what its relevance should be. It's about social interchange. It's not about running a country.
You mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that what happened after the fall of the wall and the end of the Cold War is that we lost a sense of a great debate. Hasn't that reappeared now in the guise of China, maybe Russia, but particularly China and their social credit system and the kind of reinvention of a digital totalitarianism in China?
Let me say something about China. First of all, what China has achieved in terms of its economic strength and therefore its political influence and perhaps military capability, it should have achieved 50 years ago. If it hadn't been for the lunacies of Mao Zedong and the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, China, as a massive country with a huge 2,000-year history, we know it would have been a superpower a generation ago. How do we know that? Because look at other Chinese communities, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore. Wherever the Chinese have been allowed to apply capitalist economics, they've not only done so successfully, they've done marvelously. They have led the world in many cases. What Xi Jinping is now doing is he's actually, consciously or unconsciously, trying to mislead the world. Because he's trying to imply that, look at the transformation of China. We have done this, not in a Western system, but combined with essentially a single-party dictatorship. Maybe not with the words he uses, but that's effectively what he said. This is a model for the many countries around the world. If you want to have our level of economic success, you must have give thought to our political system. That is a total distortion, because he likes to imply that democracy and the rule of law are Western values. They're not Western values, they're universal values. And to prove that, you just have to look not at Europe, look at other parts of Asia. We discussed this earlier.
India.
South Korea, India, Indonesia. These are all countries that have become hugely wealthier than they were over the last 50 years. And they've done it combined with democratic systems and the rule of law.
What do we need to do that we're not doing at the moment to strengthen democracy, its credibility, its institutions, its political parties?
I think the way I would answer your question is to say, what is it about liberal values? What do we mean by liberal values? Because if you have liberal values, you're pretty certain to have democracy most of the time. If you lose them, then democracy itself may come under threat. Liberal values basically means two things. It means the rule of law, and it means the respect for minorities, that the majority doesn't take all. 51% doesn't allow you to ignore. Now, what we are seeing in authoritarian states is they're saying, because we won the election, therefore we can be beastly to immigrants, we can be beastly to ethnic minorities.
Trump's doing that, isn't he?
Well, sure he is, because he doesn't believe in liberal values. But he's doing it on the basis of what he thinks is a mandate he was given. So that is something that has to be fought against unambiguously. The other point is when we talk about the rule of law, we must be very clear what we mean by that. I was talking about China a few moments ago. I must tell you what actually happened, which illustrates the point I want to make. When I was Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, it was at the time when we were at the final stage of debating the handover of Hong Kong back to China, which had to happen. That's what the international law required. And I was visiting Beijing to see the Chinese foreign minister, and I visited through Hong Kong. And when I was in Hong Kong, people in Hong Kong said, when you see the Chinese minister, will you please impress upon him that what we are most worried about when we become part of China is not just whether we'll be able to vote for more than one candidate in Hong Kong elections. That's important for us, but that's not the only thing. Much more important in some respects is will we continue to enjoy the rule of law, by which, of course, they meant independent judges and free speech and all the other things that we're talking about. So I promised I would take this up with the minister. When I saw him, I said, the people of Hong Kong are worried whether they will still enjoy the rule of law when they become part of China. And I have never forgotten his answer. He looked at me and said, please do not worry, Mr. Rifkind. In China, we too believe in the rule of law. In China, the people must obey the law. And I said, now hold on a moment. When we talk about the rule of law, it's not just the people who must obey the law, it's the government must be under the law. And to be under the law means you have to have independent judges and courts and freedom of speech and free newspapers and press, media. He not only didn't agree with me, he had the faintest idea what I was talking about. Because effectively what they have in China and in Putin's Russia is not the rule of law, it's rule by law. It's a very different thing. They call it rule of law, but it's rule by law. You use the legal system to actually suppress opposition, so that political opposition becomes not just unacceptable, it becomes criminal, and therefore it justifies you locking up your opponents. And you use, as they are now in China, using the most modern technology. Think of what's happening, terrible things that are happening in Xinjiang with the Chinese Muslim community there being effectively imprisoned in order to be re-educated. Now, that's not rule of law, but that's rule by law, using a law that they themselves pass.
So the great debate in the 21st century is the rule of law versus the rule by law.
I think you could do a lot worse than describing it in those terms, yes.